Hi everybody, Greyfist here. I'm posting this in early October, which means that it is about a month away from the 2014 midterm elections here in the United States. And I happened to vote 2 days ago. I'm living outside of my current state of residence, and so I had to vote absentee, so I mailed it in, and all is done. So now I can only hope that the candidates that I'm voting for and who I hope will win will in fact win. That being said, there have been some thoughts on my mind about the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, and their economic policies, and how those economic policies are intended to work, ideally, how they really work in reality, and how those things affect us. So in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I view economic policy in our economy, and I hope to, at the very least, inspire you to think of economic policy and political policy in a slightly different way. Alright, so let's get started here. The image on your screen shows basically how I believe that our society works. It's a very watered down, very simplistic version. We basically have three entities: people, businesses, and government. And of course that there are some others that I haven't included here that do play important roles. Banks, for example, would be the first one that comes to my mind. But I think that this generally gets the full grasp of our society and how it works. And you can see that the various arrows going between the different entities show what each does for the other and vice versa. So I'm going to now, on this next image, show a little bit more detail in how this interplay between the three entities works. Now I realize that this image is a little bit busy or complicated to look at, so I'm going to go through each of them very briefly and show you what each does for the others. So we'll start with businesses. Businesses offer employment to the people. They also offer goods and services, but people also offer to businesses their service. Businesses can't operate if there aren't people working for them. On the other hand, businesses pay taxes to the governments. They also will buy bonds. In terms of their investments, they may buy federal, state, or local bonds. And then, particularly with multinationals, they will invest in foreign banks and foreign investments. So next we'll take a look at how people function in the society. As I mentioned before, the people provide their services to businesses. They also, particularly the rich and the middle class, they provide investments into the businesses, which allows them to grow. This includes stocks, mutual funds, corporate bonds, things of that nature. The rich, especially, will invest some, if not much, of their money into foreign banks. We can see that, for example, with Mitt Romney, who releases taxes in mid-2012 when he was running his presidential election campaign, and we saw that he had quite a bit of money in foreign banks where it is not being taxed by the federal government. On the other hand, people offer their services to government through employment, and government of course benefits from that employment. You can have a government without people working in it. They all pay taxes, and the rich and the middle class in particular buy government bonds, just like the businesses do. Finally, we have the government, and this is the more complicated of the three, in my opinion. And of course, even with this, which is pretty crammed full, this doesn't cover nearly all of the things that government does for us. And if you want to see more, all you have to do is look it up. I'm sure that you can find a breakdown of the federal, state, or city-county budget in your area. But there are a couple things that I wanted to point out. First of all, each of these arrows is about the same size, which hides the relative sizes. So if you were to actually look at what constitutes the largest, and for the rest of this video I'm going to be largely focusing on the federal government, but this is also true of states as well. The federal government spends the most on subsidies, which is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and it also spends the most on military. Those two sections account for about 75% of the federal budget. The rest of it's split up amongst things like Department of the Interior, Department of Energy, NASA, National Institute of Arts, FDA, EPA, so on and so forth. There are many others. Alright, so now that we've had a quick look at the different entities in our society and how they interplay with each other, I would like to start looking at the economic policies of Republicans and Democrats, and I'd like to show how they are supposed to work ideally and how they actually work in reality. Before I do that, though, there are 2 points that I wish to make. The first is that money isn't usually destroyed. We did see a lot of wealth destroyed in 2008 in the financial crash, for example, but in terms of actual wages or salaries, for example, if you pay a government employee a salary, that money doesn't just disappear. You know, a lot of the conservatives will talk about government pensions and so on and so forth, like liberals are taking these huge dump trucks full of cash and just dumping them into a black hole. But that's not what's really happening. Now, arguments can be made about the efficiency of taking money from the population and from specific portions of the population in order to spend it on services to promote the common good, and you can also argue what the common good is, but I won't be making those arguments today. The real point is that when government takes in taxes and then spends the money, largely the money returns to the American population, either in the form of government salaries, which are then spent in the United States as largely, or to contracts to private corporations, which will then pay largely American workers who will then spend their salaries in America. So the money doesn't just disappear, it actually stays within the system, as I'm going to show in just a moment. The second point is that economic policies exist in a continuum that is multidimensional, but it can be simplified to basically capitalist versus socialist. The United States is not a capitalist free-for-all, despite what some liberals may feel, nor is it a socialistic empire, despite what many conservatives may feel. The U.S. exists closer to the capitalistic side of the spectrum, but the economy still exists within regulations, and there is still a large and ever-increasing wealth gap between the rich and poor, which is something that you wouldn't see in a social economy. What do the two parties stand for? Liberals generally support higher taxes and higher spending. Traditionally, they are the party supporting big government, although George W. Bush's tenure in the White House and subsequent efforts by conservative legislatures across the country to regulate people's private lives seem to have laid the difference in size to rest. George W. Bush presided over one of the largest increases in government in modern times. Liberals support greater regulation of corporations in particular. Conservatives, in contrast, have traditionally supported fewer taxes, particularly on the wealthy and businesses, fewer regulations on corporations and the free market, and fewer government functions. Both viewpoints have some merit, and I'll be discussing the limits of each and what I believe is the best compromise. So let's suppose that conservatives get all that they want. They reduce or eliminate taxes on the wealthy, or the job creators as they like to call them. They reduce taxes on businesses, and they reduce the role of government in our society. What happens? Well, businesses and the rich then have more money. Ideally, the rich then invest in businesses by purchasing stocks and corporate bonds, giving businesses even more money. Businesses are then able to increase employment and expand their operations with the extra funds that they now have. That's what would happen ideally, and there are economic situations in which this approach would be advantageous. Unfortunately for conservatives and for the rest of us when they're in power, society is almost never in the position where this is an ideal course of action. There are several reasons that this fails generally. The first is that when the wealthy have more money, they don't always invest it. Many of the most wealthy allow their money to sit in banks, either here in the U.S. or offshore, where it can't be taxed, like Mitt Romney, as I mentioned earlier. Multinationals will also do this. Sometimes that money is useful. When banks have large cash deposits, they can loan more freely and cheaply, thereby allowing businesses to expand. So it's an indirect method of businesses getting money for expansion operations. The problem really comes from large multinationals, though. Most large multinationals are saturated in the American market, i.e. they can't expand much more, if at all. For example, there's a Walmart in just about every single city in the United States. Walmart can't just keep building more Walmarts. What can Walmart do? Well, Walmart is expanding in foreign countries. In China, for example, that I know is one of their prime focuses. But when that happens, when the rich invest in large multinationals that are expanding in foreign countries, and when multinationals invest the money that they do have in foreign expansion, the money that's in the U.S. economy is flowing out of the economy. And although some of it does come back in the form of corporate profits, a lot of that goes straight back to the wealthy because they are the ones that own the corporations and they're the ones that own the stocks. You know, it's a very small percentage of the stock market that is controlled by the middle class, and there's almost none of it that's controlled by the poor. Another problem with using banks to loan monies to businesses to expand is that we have a very strong Federal Reserve in this country, and the Federal Reserve has a variable interest rate. For example, in 2008, during the most recent economic recession, and thereafter almost until now, I think, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates as much as it could to historic lows, as they would say, over and over on the month after month. The reason for this was that they wanted to make borrowing money easy so that people could borrow the money and then expand their houses or their businesses or whatever. The hope was that by borrowing the money and then spending it, we would jumpstart the economy. To a certain extent, that did help. I'm not an economist, so I can't say to what extent, but it is something that does happen. And so the money supply that banks are actually holding is not as influential as it might be if there wasn't a strong Federal Reserve. So another argument against this idea of, you know, cutting taxes on the wealthy so that they can give money to businesses to expand is that U.S. corporations have been sitting on record quantities of cash for years now. They're not investing, they're not expanding, they are just holding on to money. There's an article that I found recently that stated that, I think this was for 2013, that U.S. corporations outside of the finance industry are sitting on a record $1.64 trillion in cash. The previous record was set in 2012, and I've included a link to that article below in the description. And so what happens is you get this whirlpool of money flowing from the wealthy to corporations, and then a lot of that money flows out of the country. Some of it comes back in terms of corporate profits, but then that money gets siphoned back to either dividends or capital gains as stocks increase in value to the wealthy. And so there's never this sort of magical trickle down that conservatives will often talk about. It doesn't happen. And particularly when you don't have regulations on corporations and you don't have a strong minimum wage, for example, the money just never really makes it down. It just keeps cycling around at the topmost levels of society, and a lot of it, like I said, flows out of the country. So when is decreasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations advantageous? Well, the goal is to spur investment into and expansion by corporations. If this were an undeveloped nation with lots of expansion potential and weak government control of fiscal policy, perhaps that would be accomplished by lowering taxes on the wealthy. But as we'll get to shortly, this can only be part of the answer. Now, what if liberals got all that they wanted? Higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations, increased spending, and increased regulations. Money flows from the wealthy and corporations into the government. The government then spends more money on infrastructure, education, research, regulation, and subsidies to and social safety nets for the poor. What happens to this money? Well, as I stated earlier, money isn't usually destroyed. When you pay for infrastructure, construction workers get paid for working on those projects. If you funnel more money into education, teachers get paid more, and more teachers get paid, and they are better able to teach with more resources. People and corporations at large get better roads, bridges, canals, ports, communication networks, etc. There's lots of things that they get from that. People also benefit from increased safety and environmental regulations. For example, we all get to breathe relatively clean air, we get to drink relatively clean water, our food is mostly inspected for safety concerns and proper handling. and humanity in general will benefit from the research performed by U.S. scientists. Now, what about subsidies to the poor, such as welfare and food stamps, Medicaid? Unlike the wealthy, the poor spend virtually every cent they have, and they don't spend it on foreign concerns. They spend it on food, clothing, transportation, and services, and all of those things are provided locally, many of them are made locally, and the services are offered locally. They're not foreign entities. Yes, if you buy crap from Walmart, a lot of it's going to be made in China, but nevertheless, a lot of that money is being spent in the United States. It does get taxed, and it does go to paying Walmart workers meager salaries. Meanwhile, increased consumption encourages corporations to expand in the U.S. With less money on hand and more reason to expand here, multinationals are less likely to invest in foreign affairs because whether you make it in China or the United States, if you make it in China, you have to ship it back to the United States. In many cases, it may be cheaper to produce here, simply because you can eliminate the shipping costs, particularly if there's a large demand here. The other thing is that with multinationals having less money on hand, they're less able to afford expensive lobbying teams to buy politicians, which is good for all of us. Not to say that if we increase taxes on them, they won't be able to lobby, but it will be hopefully diminished. Now, at this point, some of my conservative watchers may be saying, but regulations kill businesses. It's something that we hear conservatives say all the time. It is true that regulations and bureaucracy can be a burden and should be limited whenever possible. The thing that conservatives forget, however, is that when it comes to free markets, they operate in whatever framework they exist within. If two companies are both required to pay their employees the same amount, or both are prohibited from polluting the environment in the same way, then both will have the same costs. If one company can get a legal financial benefit over the other, then the other company will eventually fail as consumers choose the cheaper option. This observation breaks down, however, when multinationals compete against small to medium businesses. Walmart and Apple are good examples of this. Walmart's practice of entering a community with a mom-and-pop store, slashing prices to the point of losing money, and thereby driving the competition out of business only to increase prices and have a monopoly in that town later on, are very well documented. The only reason that they can do this is because they are so big. A large company can afford to subsidize a single store's temporary losses as they drive the competition out of business. Small and medium-sized businesses cannot do the same. Another breakdown in the process is well exemplified by Apple. Apple manufactures virtually everything it sells in China, where labor is cheap and regulations are nearly non-existent. Suppose for the moment that some investor has plans for the next iPod. Suppose also that Apple has those plans. The independent inventor, more likely than not, does not have the resources nor the knowledge required to open up a factory in China in order to manufacture their product at a competitive price. Therefore, Apple will prevent the next company's entrance into the market by acting in a different free market than their competitor. On the other hand, if tariffs are imposed on foreign imports, Apple may be forced to manufacture here to keep prices down, thereby giving the competitor a chance. Similarly, if Walmart were to be severely penalized for predatory business practices, as described before, perhaps they would be unwilling to cut prices so low that the mom-and-pop stores are driven out of business. If the large energy companies were fined adequately for pollution, perhaps renewable startups would have a competitive chance. I am no economist, but I believe that many regulations are, in fact, beneficial to most businesses, and particularly to those that are small to medium-sized. Now, when do these policies break down? Some products simply cannot be made in the U.S. due to resource limitations. For example, China produces most of the rare earth metals which are essential in electronics manufacture, perhaps excusing Apple to some extent, although they're guilty of many other, in my opinion, social crimes. But as mentioned before, too much bureaucracy can limit the economy, but as I pointed out, I think we are far from that point. What about giving incentive for people to work hard? Won't creating a welfare state remove incentive to work? First of all, do you think that the men and women that work for minimum wage at 2 or more jobs and still rely on food stamps aren't working hard? When was the last time that you worked more than 60 hours in a week? 80 or 100? Don't you think that they work hard to give themselves and their families better lives like the rest of us do? I often work night shifts at my work because I like the solitude and quiet, and so I often observe cleaning people working hard and yet still only earning a meager minimum wage. There's a study that my dad likes to cite that said that people that make $70,000 a year are the happiest. Above that amount, the stress and responsibility subtract from a person's happiness, despite improving their financial well-being. Below that amount, and financial insecurity plagues a person's psyche. I think that we can increase these people's standard of living without removing incentives to work hard and to rise up to that $70,000 a year level. Now, on the extreme end, yes, taxes that are too high can discourage hard work. For example, why would I be going through 10 years of post-secondary education if I were only to make as much as the local janitor with no post-secondary education? There are reasons, of course, like job satisfaction and enjoyment, but for many that would not be enough. Similarly, inventors and entrepreneurs might be less likely to take risks if a more certain and large source of income were available to them. That is socialism in a nutshell, but as I pointed out, we are nowhere near that end of the spectrum. Europe is much closer to the socialistic end of the spectrum than we are. In fact, by their standards, our Liberal Party is their conservative party, and yet they still have a thriving economy with inventors, entrepreneurs, and scientists. Warren Buffett once said that people invest to make money, and potential taxes have never scared them off, in reference to modest tax increases. As one of the foremost investors and richest people in the world, I think it's safe to say that his statement, in my line of reasoning, proves that we are not living in a socialist dystopia. So, to summarize, I posted here two pictures representing the cycles produced by the two parties' economic policies, as I see them in the real world. One cycles from the rich to large corporations, which are largely owned by the rich, and siphons more money out of the country. The other cycles money between the poor, the businesses and the wealthy, and the government, with less spillage out of the system. So I'm posting this video, like I said, less than a month before the 2014 midterm elections. I'm hoping that this video has provided some information and perhaps a different perspective on your choice in November. I think that it's very important to sit down and consider how policy theoretically works and what the real-world evidence shows about these theories. I hope that you will vote for Democrats next month because I believe that they have the superior policy. But most of all, I hope that you go out and vote regardless of who you're going to vote for. So thank you very much. I hope that you found this interesting. If you like what I've done here, check out some of my other videos, like, subscribe, etc.